Disclaimer: this episode may include graphic descriptions of crime and criminal activity. It therefore may not be suitable for listeners who are under the age of 18 or people who may find the descriptions as disturbing. Listeners' discretion is advised from this point forward. Hello and welcome to this episode of Crime KE podcast. My good name is Ajuma. I am a journalist from Kenya and your host for this true crime podcast. Today's episode is part 2 of the story of Kenya's self-confessed serial killer, Philip Onyancha. Part 1 went out last week on Thursday, and if you haven't listened to it, I'd suggest that you catch up on that before you listen to this episode. There's a probability that you might not understand some of the references in this episode if you haven't listened to part 1, so I think you should pause and go back if you haven't. Then you can come back and listen to this. Now, in last week's episode, I talked about Onyancha's activities from basically birth until when he was arrested. And in this week's episode, I want to delve into the confession, his trials, and even where he is today. This is a story that is crazy and heartbreaking for the victims and their families, and I don't know how I feel about the fact that I found out that depending on the circumstances, Onyancha may actually be set free. So without further ado, let us get into today's episode. Also, please stick around until the end of this episode to find out how you can support this podcast. Now, at this point, Philip Onyancha had been arrested, and he tells the police that he has murdered a total of 18 victims. He says that all his victims were women and children, and he even says that they were easy targets because he regarded them as weak and vulnerable. When he was asked why he did what he did, Onyancha said that the devil made him do it. Now, I want you to buckle up because we are about to enter into cults and cult initiation territory. Onyancha said that he was initiated into a murderer's cult when he was in high school. He says that his teacher, who was identified as Elizabeth Wamboi, initiated him into a cult that ordered him to take the lives of 100 people, and then after that he would be given wealth in return. He said that his teacher had an unhealthy obsession with him in high school, and she would even invite him to her house for food and drinks from time to time. Onyancha said that since he was a prefect, most of the time people did not notice when he was absent in the dormitory at school. He would sneak out of school and go to the teacher's quarters to this specific teacher's house, and they would be having conversations until very late into the night. Now, apparently, one time during his visit, the teacher made a cut across Onyancha's chest and collected blood. Then she put what looked like ash on the wound that remained in his chest. Now, according to Onyancha's confession, from that point forward, this teacher was able to control him to the point that she would even appear in his dreams. At this time, he said that he also started hearing voices that would tell him what to do. And for the most part, Onyancha cooperated with police in the investigation. He walked police in a search and tour mission across Kenya to all his crime scenes. He did this while recounting to the police how he carried out these heinous killings in detail. This search mission began in Dagoretti Corner, where he took police to several motel rooms where he murdered women. Some of the women he claimed to have murdered, their cases had not been investigated because it was assumed that they had died of natural causes. One of the women, identified as Jacqueline, who had been found dead in May of 2008, her death had been ruled as a suicide, and her family had known that she had died by suicide, but now Onyancha was confessing to having murdered her. Now, from Dagoretti, the police were taken to Thika, where Onyancha confessed to murdering several sex workers in motel rooms. If you listen to part 1, then you remember Helen Nyambura, who was found in a motel room after several days, and her death was ruled to have been caused by an epileptic seizure. Now, Onyancha was now here confessing to having murdered her, and now the disappearances that were happening in Thika at that time could now be investigated with a possible lead. Onyancha told the police that after he killed Helen in that motel room, he had come back to the motel several times to see her body before she was found. Remember, she was found like several days after she died. He said that he could not believe that he had actually killed her. Now, according to Onyancha, he would often go into a trance when committing the murders, and once he got out of the trance, he wouldn't remember what he had done while in the trance and even why he had done it. I have a clip of Onyancha speaking to Case Files about this experience of having a trance, so listen to it.
So I'm like, the other party is telling me, you didn't do it. The other party is telling me, you did it. So I'm split between two choices. So I had to physically go there, confirm to myself, is it real? So I used to visit that place even after the body was discovered several times. I can count. It was 7 to 10 times I used to revisit that place, asking myself, is this real? So I'm like, I was disturbed.
Onyancha said that he always felt the pressure from the cult to deliver. Remember, he had been told to kill 100 people to be given wealth. He said that he would often feel so powerful and unstoppable after committing a murder. He even said that the murders almost gave him supernatural abilities. And he believed that that was the reason why, even though he was closer to the police than they think, the police did not think that he was the murderer. Remember, he would be going for the searches of missing people that he actually made disappear. He would even be in crowds of people as police carried out bodies of women he had killed in those hotel rooms. He confessed to the police that he had enlisted the help of two men identified as Tobias and Douglas to kidnap his victims. He said that the two helped him in capturing his victims, making the threatening phone calls to the families of the victims that were kidnapped, and even delivering the ransom notes to the families of the victims. Onyancha said that most of the times when these notes were sent, the victims were already dead. So I don't know if he just wanted to torment the family or if he just wanted the money. During his tour of Kenya with the police, he took the police to several places where he had hidden the victims, and some of the victims were just being found. These were people who had been missing for years. I mentioned the 32-year-old mother named Catherine, who had gone missing in November 2008 in last week's episode. Onyancha took the police to his former workplace at the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Company, where he had stashed her in a sewer after killing her. By the time Catherine was being found, she had been missing for 2 years. Onyancha said that Catherine was the second victim that he had ever killed. He was working as a security guard at the Nairobi Water and Sewerage Company when Catherine approached him to ask for directions. Onyancha said that as soon as he identified a potential victim, he tried as much as possible to make sure that he shakes their hand. He said that his power to persuade the victim was in the handshake. Like when he shakes their hands, the rest was easy to accomplish. So when Catherine approached him to ask for directions, he shook her hand and told her that he would take her where she was going, knowing that he had other plans. He said that he entered the trance and murdered her and stashed her body in the company's sewer. And nobody ever realized that Catherine's body was there until he took the police there. The story of Catherine was particularly scary to me because to those of us who don't know the corners of Nairobi, we are always told that the security guards you see in buildings are the safest people to ask for directions because you just can't trust anyone in Nairobi. So Catherine could have been any one of us. It could have been me and it could have been you. During this tour, he also took police to a house where he worked as a security guard. And in the house, he showed police a victim that he had killed and stashed their body in the ceiling. Nobody had found this victim, including the family who lived in the house. It wasn't until Onyancha brought the police that the owners of the house realized that they had been living with a dead body lying in their house ceiling. Now, after Onyancha confessed, he admitted that after telling everything to the police, he felt relieved and he felt like he could go back to himself. He said that keeping the secret of the murders was hard and that there were moments when he had even wanted to make anonymous phone calls to radio stations to confess because just keeping this secret weighed heavily on him. But he would always keep quiet because the people who initiated him into the cult had warned him that if he ever confessed to the murders, he would lose all the powers he had that he had acquired from the cult. He said that this police confession was actually the first time that he had admitted to the murders and revealed the details of what happened. Nobody who was close to him knew about the things that he had done because to everyone else he acted normal. He was a normal husband to his wife and a normal father to his son. He has even been compared to Ted Bundy on multiple occasions. Now, Ted Bundy is an American serial killer. If you haven't heard of Ted Bundy, then you can easily find information on his activities online. There's even a documentary on him on Netflix. Now, Ted Bundy is known for kidnapping and raping and murdering women in America. He was electrocuted to death after being found guilty of at least 20 murders. He confessed to 30 murders, but it is generally suspected that he committed more murders than that. The reason why Onyancha was compared to Ted Bundy, though, was because they were both considered soft-spoken and innocent-looking despite being evil enough to commit that many murders. Onyancha would swear that despite the fact that he murdered the people, he was not actually himself when he was killing them. He said that he had these voices in his head that would always instruct him to do things. Like the voices would tell him to leave work before it was time to clock out. They would tell him to maybe go to Nyeri or Thika. They would identify a victim for him, then would tell him to kill the victim. He would only realize what he had done after he had killed the victims. And the other thing is, he would kill his victims and he would not steal from them. Like, it seemed like his only motive was to kill. Now, most of his victims remained unidentified, and most of his crimes happened in Thika. And the thing is, at the time that Onyancha was arrested, his teacher, who he said that had initiated him into the cult, was teaching at a school in Thika. This teacher was actually arrested. Some sources say that she surrendered herself to the police. Others say that she was arrested. Either way, she was charged with administering an unlawful oath and even taken to court. She denied ever initiating Onyancha into a cult, and at some point she even denied knowing Onyancha. On September 11th of 2010, her trial begins and ends almost as immediately as it began. She was eventually released after she told the court that Onyancha's claims that she initiated him into a cult were fabricated. Also, I think that apart from Onyancha's confession, there wasn't really any evidence that she had actually initiated him into a cult. Onyancha admitted everything in the confessions apart from rumors that he drank the blood of his victims. This was a claim that was repeated even in several media reports, but he said that they were false. He apologized to the families of the victims and asked for the police to keep him in jail away from the public outrage outside. He stayed in jail as he waited for the trial to begin. He underwent a mental evaluation to determine if he was fit to stand trial before he could actually be presented in court for the murders. The neighbor who made him move away from home came forward. Now, if you listen to part 1, then you remember the reason why Onyancha moved to Nairobi may have been that a neighbor had accused him of attempted rape and physical assault. This neighbor saw that he had been arrested, and now she came forward and pressed charges officially against him. He was found guilty in this case and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. This conviction gave the police and the prosecutors more time to gather evidence and prepare for the quote-unquote big trial. While in prison, Onyancha even undergoes a surgery to remove the growth that was at the back of his head. Now, several source materials say that at the time of the surgery, the tumor had grown to the size of a small orange. In 2014, Onyancha pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. He disowned the confessions and said that he was not in his right senses when he confessed. Now, a mental evaluation at this time determines that Onyancha cannot be released because he is likely to reoffend. I don't even know why they're thinking about releasing him. They have not even had a proper trial. 3 years pass and there is very little movement in the case. At this point, the prosecutors are tired and they want everything to move forward. Things are moving really slowly in this case. The prosecution at this time files a petition to have the court make a ruling in Onyancha's case. This ruling would say that instead of a full trial, Onyancha should be jailed at the pleasure of the president. Now, this means that he would remain in prison until government experts determine that he is of sound mind and not a threat to society. He was evaluated twice since then and he was found to be at a high risk of reoffending. In 2018, the High Court determines that the prosecution may have used the mental evaluation examinations to Onyancha's disadvantage. The court said that it could not understand how the prosecution says that the mental evaluations found that he was mentally fit to stand trial, but not mentally fit to be let back into society. So at that point, all these hearings against him were scrapped and the court actually declared a mistrial. The court even dropped the cases of several victims because they say that there was a lack of evidence. The prosecution had relied very heavily on circumstantial evidence and the confession that Onyancha made, which was unreliable because he had said that he came back and disowned the confession. The court said that despite his confession, Onyancha deserved to be given his right to a fair trial despite what is believed to have done. In 2021, he was acquitted of the murder of Jacqueline, who I actually mentioned in part 1. He was actually facing the death penalty in this case, but the prosecution did not present enough evidence to get a conviction. Currently, Onyancha's trial charges are pending and nobody really knows what his fate could be. One report I found say that because of the ruling made by the court for him to be jailed at the pleasure of the president, he could actually be released if a mental evaluation determines that he is well enough to be reintegrated into society. In the last interview that I found of Onyancha, he said that he had changed his life and found Jesus and he is currently a preacher in prison. He works as a bookkeeper and he hopes to be released so that he can open and lead his own church. That was part 2 and the final part of Philip Onyancha's story. I appreciate you for listening till the end. Now, I couldn't stop thinking about the meaning of justice, especially in this case. Okay, Onyancha is in prison, but what about the families of the victims who are told, yes, this guy killed your loved one, but there hasn't really been a sentence, or should I say trial? I don't know how to explain it. I would actually love to sit down with a family member of a victim of Onyancha and hear what they have to say, if they feel like they got some sort of justice in their family member's case. But with all that said and done, you can support this podcast by sharing it with your friends so that we can reach a larger community of listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, share it on social media and tag us at crime.ke on Instagram. I love interacting with you guys on the socials. So if you have listened to it and you love it, you can share and tag me or the podcast. You can reach me through my social media at Ajuma on Instagram, X, and TikTok. And I am at Ajuma Millicent on Facebook and LinkedIn. I have provided my social media handles in the show notes of this episode, so that should be easier for you to find. Follow the podcast on Instagram at crime.ke and interact with our post. I also shared updates on the cases I talked about in season 1. So if you're not following us on Instagram, then you're missing out on some of the details of these cases. If there's a specific story that you want to listen to in this season of the podcast, then you can always DM me on the podcast on Instagram. This season is called Kenya's Most Wanted, which highlights the stories of Kenya's most wanted criminals in history. So if you have a specific person whose story you want me to research and share on the podcast, then you can always DM me of the podcast on Instagram. If you want to share any feedback, you can send in voice messages through the email that is in the show notes of the episode. Then maybe I can play some of the messages after the episodes. Rate the podcast on the platform that you're listening in from, and don't forget to catch the next episode of Crime KE podcast on Thursday next week. Same time, same place. But until then, stay safe and remember, it's crime with a K.